The story of Lucky Luciano's return from exile begins not in the streets of New York, nor in the shadowed alleys of the mafia's strongholds, but in the collective imagination of America itself. By the mid-1940s, the name Luciano had become almost mythic, a whisper in smoky backrooms, a shadow behind the headlines, a figure whose influence stretched far beyond the confines of prison bars or the courtroom drama that had once made him infamous. He was a ghost in every sense, a man whose absence had left a vacuum in the underworld, yet whose legend continued to shape it. And now, after years of enforced separation from the world he had built, Luciano was preparing to step back into a stage that had shifted, evolved, and grown in his absence. The anticipation was palpable, both in the criminal underworld and among the public that had devoured every sensationalized story about him. To understand the gravity of Luciano's return, it is crucial to picture the world that awaited him. Post-war America was a country in transition, teetering between prosperity and the remnants of the chaos that had defined the Depression era. Cities were bustling, the economy was expanding, and yet beneath the surface organized crime had adapted, mutated, and entrenched itself in ways even Luciano had not fully foreseen. In New York and other urban centers, new faces had emerged, figures who had risen in the power vacuum left by his imprisonment and deportation. Some were ambitious, some ruthless, but all had to navigate a landscape that had once been carefully engineered by Luciano himself. It was a world where loyalty could no longer be assumed, where alliances were fragile, and where betrayal could happen with a whisper. The underworld had evolved, and Luciano, returning from exile, would have to confront a truth as stark as it was inevitable. Power was never permanent, and even a legend could be tested. Yet the allure of Luciano was not merely about his strategic genius or his ability to orchestrate criminal enterprises. It was also about the psychology of the man, the magnetic combination of charm and menace that allowed him to command loyalty, instill fear, and manipulate events to his advantage. Even from afar, stories of his cunning had spread like wildfire. Law enforcement officers, politicians, journalists, and rival gangsters alike spoke of him with a mixture of admiration, apprehension, and outright terror. Some recalled his ability to sit calmly in a room while plans for murder or empire building unfolded around him, his mind always 3 steps ahead, calculating the risks, anticipating the reactions, and turning chaos into opportunity. Others remembered the personal side, the charisma, the humor, the sharp intelligence that could disarm even the most skeptical observer. It was this duality, the tension between ruthlessness and charisma, that had made him a legend, and it was this duality that would define his return. The emotional weight of his comeback was equally complex. For Luciano, exile had been both punishment and reflection. Stripped of his kingdom, forced to watch from a distance as the empire he built continued without him, he had experienced the bitter lessons of impermanence. The streets he once ruled with calculated precision now felt alien, and the faces of former allies carried the marks of time, ambition, and shifting loyalties. The psychological journey he faced was not merely about reclaiming lost territory, but about navigating a world in which he could no longer assume that respect alone would secure obedience. He would have to read every room, every handshake, every glance for hints of loyalty or treachery. Every decision would carry the weight of decades of experience, sharpened instincts, and the haunting knowledge that missteps could be fatal. From a narrative standpoint, Luciano's return also allows us to explore the intersection of myth and reality. To the public, he was a figure almost too sensational to be real, the mastermind of the American mafia, a man who had risen from humble immigrant beginnings to command an empire of crime and influence, only to be brought low by the very laws he once evaded. To those who lived in his shadow, he was a tangible force whose absence had reshaped the underworld, whose return promised either consolidation, chaos, or both. This tension between perception and reality, between the legend and the man, provides a cinematic lens through which to understand the events to come. The story is not merely about organized crime, it is about ambition, power, loyalty, and the haunting consequences of choices made in the pursuit of dominance. As the first scenes of his return unfold, the audience is invited to experience this world as Luciano did, a world of uncertainty, danger, and psychological complexity. The streets of New York, the smoky backrooms of clandestine meetings, the quiet calculation of those plotting in exile, all converge to set the stage for a journey that is as much about human nature as it is about crime. The story begins in shadows, in the liminal space between myth and reality, where one man's return could rewrite the rules of an empire, challenge the loyalties of countless allies, and ignite the fears of those who thought the ghost had finally vanished. It is in this charged atmosphere of suspense, reflection, and looming confrontation that the legend of Lucky Luciano begins its next chapter. A chapter defined not only by the actions he would take, but by the psychological and emotional truths that his return would reveal. By the time Lucky Luciano's name began resurfacing in whispers across New York and beyond, the criminal underworld had already undergone a quiet, yet profound transformation. The golden age of crime, as historians and journalists would later call it, was both a period of extraordinary wealth and ruthless disorder. Cities throbbed with illicit activity, fueled by prohibition's fading echoes and the opportunities left in its wake. The mafia, once a scattered network of small-time gangs and street enforcers, had begun consolidating power, but not without chaos, rivalries, and bloodshed. The streets were a chessboard, and every move could mean either expansion or elimination. This was the world that Luciano had once dominated, a world that now demanded careful observation if he hoped to reclaim even a fragment of his former empire. Before Luciano's exile, the mafia had been fragmented, a loose constellation of families more concerned with survival than strategy. Each gang controlled its own territory, but there was no overarching structure, no governing council to arbitrate disputes or regulate business. Turf wars were common, and allegiances were as transient as they were dangerous. Violence was a language everyone understood, yet one that left the underworld vulnerable to law enforcement and internal betrayal alike. By the mid-1940s, however, this landscape had shifted. Ambitious new leaders had emerged, men who understood the value of organization, secrecy, and strategic alliances. Some were heirs to Luciano's legacy, others self-made opportunists seeking to exploit the void his absence had created. For them, crime was not merely survival, it was business, prestige, and power, calculated in dollars and influence rather than fists and fear alone. This period was defined not only by structural change but by psychological intensity. The underworld was an ecosystem of suspicion, where loyalty was tested daily, and betrayal often came with a smile. Every handshake might conceal a hidden agenda, every friendly nod could mask a knife poised for the back. In such an environment, the very concept of trust became fragile, malleable, and perilous. Luciano, with his deep understanding of human behavior and the calculus of fear, had once thrived precisely because he could navigate these dynamics with unmatched skill. Observing this world from afar, he would have seen both opportunity and threat, recognizing how far the underworld had come, and how far it had diverged from the carefully ordered empire he once commanded. During this time, the economic and social fabric of American cities played an indispensable role in the mafia's evolution. The end of prohibition did not extinguish criminal enterprise, rather, it redirected it. Gambling dens, labor rackets, narcotics trafficking, and illegal nightlife operations became the new frontier. Each new venture required diplomacy, negotiation, and occasionally brutal enforcement. The mafia was no longer merely a collection of street thugs. It was an emerging parallel society with its own rules, hierarchies, and moral codes. Wealth and influence were measured not only in banknotes but in the capacity to bend institutions, manipulate politicians, and coerce law enforcement. Luciano had once mastered this balance, and the new era reminded him that such mastery could be fleeting if vigilance faltered. Meanwhile, public perception of organized crime had begun to evolve. Newspapers sensationalized gangland killings and high-profile arrests, painting figures like Luciano as both monsters and anti-heroes. To the public, the mafia seemed omnipresent, its leaders shadowy puppeteers pulling strings from the shadows. In reality, this perception often masked the fragile alliances, calculated risks, and psychological games underpinning every move. For those within the system, life was a constant negotiation between fear and opportunity, loyalty and betrayal, survival and ambition. Luciano's impending return would test these dynamics, as old loyalties collided with new hierarchies, and the ghost of the past reminded everyone that the underworld's delicate balance was always subject to disruption. It is also crucial to recognize that this era, the so-called golden age of crime, was shaped not only by ambition but by human psychology. Fear and respect were currencies as valuable as money. Reputation once established could open doors, or invite mortal danger. Leaders emerged not merely through violence, but through perception management, charisma, and the strategic use of influence. They learned to read body language, interpret silence, and manipulate perception, understanding that the mere threat of power could achieve what force alone never could. This was the environment into which Luciano returned, a world that had matured, evolved, and adapted, yet remained susceptible to the kind of genius and cunning he had once exemplified. In addition, wartime shifts added a layer of complexity. The Second World War had drawn attention and resources away from domestic crime, but it had also created opportunities. Smuggling networks, black market enterprises, and labor rackets flourished in the shadows of war efforts. Law enforcement was stretched thin, and corrupt officials were often complicit, recognizing the benefits of negotiation over confrontation. In this environment, power was fluid, and control could be contested with careful strategy rather than brute force. For a man like Luciano, understanding these changes was paramount. His challenge would not be merely to reclaim old territory, but to navigate a transformed underworld where the rules had subtly shifted, and where every misstep could prove fatal. Ultimately, the golden age of crime was defined by contrasts: power versus chaos, loyalty versus betrayal, strategy versus violence. It was a period of extraordinary opportunity, but also extraordinary peril. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation between the old guard and the new, between myth and reality, between a man who had once ruled unchallenged and a world that had moved on without him. The story of Lucky Luciano's return is inseparable from this era, because it is the era that shaped him, challenged him, and now awaited his re-emergence. It is within this context, the tension, the intrigue, the shifting allegiances, that the narrative of his return begins, pulling the audience into a world both familiar and frightening, where every decision could mean survival or death. Lucky Luciano's story begins in the narrow, crowded streets of Italian Harlem, a labyrinth of tenements, sweat, and ambition. Born Salvatore Lucania in 1897, he arrived in New York City as a child, carrying little more than his family's dreams and the burdens of poverty. The city was a crucible, shaping young men with its unforgiving lessons in survival. Children learned early that strength, cunning, and adaptability were as vital as bread. For Luciano, these streets were both playground and battlefield, a place where every encounter, every minor insult, could carry consequences far greater than the adults around him let on. From an early age, he absorbed the rules of the urban underworld. Respect must be demanded, weakness exploited, and opportunity seized before someone else did. It was here, among the bustling chaos of immigrant life, that the foundations of his character were laid. His adolescence was marked by small but significant acts of rebellion and ambition. Luciano quickly understood that conventional avenues of success were closed to boys like him, and he gravitated toward a world where initiative, boldness, and fearlessness commanded respect. Street gangs were the incubators of future power, and Luciano proved a quick study. He learned how to read people, anticipate danger, and exploit moments of hesitation in rivals. Violence was a tool, but intelligence was the currency that truly mattered. While other boys fought for scraps of territory, Luciano began to envision a larger game, one in which he could manipulate outcomes without always resorting to brute force. This psychological acumen, his ability to see 3 steps ahead while others reacted impulsively, would become a hallmark of his leadership. Early adulthood brought the first tangible rewards for Luciano's strategic mind. He joined minor gangs, learning the ins and outs of organized crime on the ground level. These years were formative. Every extortion, every protection racket, every small heist taught lessons in logistics, loyalty, and human behavior. But Luciano's ambitions always extended beyond the narrow horizons of street-level crime. He studied the weaknesses of his peers and mentors alike, recognizing that power was rarely inherited and often fleeting. By identifying the fractures in the existing underworld, he began to position himself not just as a participant but as an architect of its future. This was the genesis of his extraordinary vision, a criminal enterprise not ruled solely by fear, but by structure, efficiency, and hierarchy. The psychological component of Luciano's rise cannot be overstated. He possessed an almost uncanny ability to blend charm and intimidation, to inspire loyalty while simultaneously instilling caution. Allies trusted him, not only because of his cunning but because they sensed that he understood human nature in ways few others did. He could read a man's intentions with subtle observation, the twitch of a hand, the hesitation in a gaze, the tone of a greeting, and use it to his advantage. This skill allowed him to maneuver through dangerous waters, forming alliances that strengthened his position while avoiding direct confrontation when possible. Violence, when employed, was precise and purposeful, never arbitrary. This combination of intelligence, foresight, and ruthlessness began to distinguish him from the countless others vying for power on the streets of New York. Luciano's rise was also fueled by ambition married to timing. The chaotic state of the mafia in the 1910s and 1920s presented both opportunities and dangers. Traditional Sicilian hierarchies were fractured, old alliances crumbled, and new forms of organization were emerging. Luciano understood that the old methods, relying solely on tradition and fear, would no longer suffice in a city growing in wealth, influence, and scrutiny. He envisioned a network that could function like a business, one in which territories, operations, and loyalties could be managed with precision. By observing the failures of his predecessors, he learned what worked and what did not. Every misstep by a rival was a lesson. Every victory by an ally was a blueprint. Beyond strategy and ambition, Luciano's personal life shaped his understanding of power and influence. Relationships, marriages, and friendships were all examined through the lens of utility and trust. He cultivated a presence that was magnetic, making allies feel indispensable while subtly reminding them of his dominance. Women, too, played roles in this complex web, providing both personal respite and social leverage. Luciano's ability to navigate these social dynamics, to balance personal ambition with relational influence, was another key factor in his ascent. It is here that the interplay of psychology and crime becomes most evident. His rise was not merely a matter of brute force, but of understanding human desires, fears, and motivations, and aligning them with his vision. By the time he entered his 20s, Luciano was no longer a street kid learning the ropes. He was a tactician, a strategist, a man with a vision of empire. Small victories on the streets, carefully managed alliances, and an acute understanding of human behavior allowed him to move from the periphery to the center of power. Each step was calculated, each relationship weighed, each opportunity evaluated for both risk and reward. His reputation grew, attracting attention from both allies and adversaries, each of whom recognized in him a force that was both unpredictable and inevitable. The early years of Luciano's rise also illuminate the stark contrast that would define his career. Compassion and cruelty, charm and menace, loyalty and betrayal, all coexisted in his world, and he wielded each with deliberate intent. These dualities were not contradictions. They were tools, employed with precision to achieve dominance. His ability to navigate moral ambiguity, to manipulate perception while maintaining authority, set him apart in an environment where many fell victim to impulsiveness, short-sightedness, or misplaced trust. Ultimately, the story of Luciano's early life and rise from immigrant streets to underworld power is a study in ambition, psychology, and adaptability. It is a story of a boy shaped by adversity who learned to see opportunity where others saw chaos, who understood the delicate balance between fear and loyalty, and who could transform violence into strategy. These formative years laid the foundation for the empire he would build, the rivalries he would navigate, and the empire he would one day attempt to reclaim after years of exile. It is here, among the narrow streets, the crowded rooms, and the harsh lessons of early life, that the seeds of legend were planted, a legend that would return to haunt and shape the underworld for decades to come. Luciano's transformation from street-level operative to architect of an empire was neither sudden nor accidental. It was the result of years of careful observation, calculated risk-taking, and an almost surgical understanding of power dynamics. By the 1920s, he had ascended far beyond the cramped tenements of Italian Harlem and the violent skirmishes of youth gangs. He now operated in a more sophisticated arena, one in which influence, money, and strategy mattered as much as bullets and intimidation. What set Luciano apart was his ability to see the bigger picture, to envision a criminal network not as a collection of fragmented gangs but as a cohesive organization capable of controlling vast swathes of New York's underworld while insulating itself from vulnerability. This vision would define his legacy and revolutionize the structure of organized crime in America. The first step in constructing his empire was the consolidation of power through strategic alliances. Luciano understood that brute force alone was insufficient to dominate a fragmented underworld. Rival factions could always mobilize, betray, or retaliate. Instead, he sought to build bridges, forging partnerships with influential figures while simultaneously neutralizing threats through calculated intimidation or removal. Key relationships with other rising mobsters were carefully curated. Some were elevated to positions of responsibility, their loyalty ensured through both incentive and fear. Others were sidelined or eliminated when their ambitions threatened the stability of the emerging hierarchy. Every alliance was deliberate, every maneuver designed to strengthen his influence while maintaining plausible deniability in the event of betrayal. Central to Luciano's empire was his recognition of the importance of structure and organization. He approached the mafia not as a loose, chaotic network but as a business, one with clear hierarchies, defined territories, and accountable leadership. Operations were compartmentalized to minimize risk. Lower-level operatives managed local rackets, mid-level lieutenants coordinated multiple ventures, and top-tier leadership oversaw the entire network, ensuring that no single failure could collapse the system. This approach reduced exposure to law enforcement while maximizing efficiency and profits. It was a radical departure from the traditional methods of Sicilian gangs, which relied heavily on personal loyalty and fear, often leaving the organization vulnerable to internal strife. Luciano's genius lay in blending old-world codes of honor with modern managerial tactics, creating a hybrid system that was both disciplined and adaptable. Luciano's understanding of human psychology was as crucial as his structural innovations. He had an almost preternatural ability to read people, judging their intentions, weaknesses, and ambitions with remarkable precision. This allowed him to manipulate both allies and enemies, cultivating loyalty through respect and charisma while subtly reminding associates of the consequences of disloyalty. Fear was always present, but it was never arbitrary. It was a tool wielded with purpose. Those who aligned with Luciano found both protection and opportunity. Those who defied him found themselves isolated, vulnerable, or worse. In this way, he transformed interpersonal dynamics into instruments of power, making his empire resilient against both external threats and internal dissent. A critical aspect of Luciano's strategy was his foresight in economic diversification. He understood that relying on a single stream of illicit income would render his empire unstable. Prohibition had provided the initial framework for wealth through bootlegging, but the repeal of alcohol sales forced the underworld to adapt. Luciano pivoted quickly, expanding into gambling, prostitution, labor rackets, and narcotics. Each operation carefully managed to maximize profit while minimizing exposure. He fostered relationships with corrupt officials and union leaders, ensuring that his enterprises could operate with a veneer of legitimacy when necessary. By transforming crime into a multi-layered business empire, Luciano demonstrated not only ambition but a rare acumen for logistics, finance, and risk management, a combination that elevated him above mere street bosses. The consolidation of power also required a keen awareness of optics. Luciano understood the importance of reputation, both within the underworld and in the public eye. Media attention, rumors, and the fear he inspired were tools he could exploit to enhance influence without direct confrontation. By cultivating an image that combined menace with sophistication, he created a persona that extended the reach of his authority beyond immediate interactions. His ability to shape perception was as powerful as any weapon in his arsenal, allowing him to negotiate from positions of strength, intimidate rivals without violence, and maintain control over a sprawling, complex network. Perhaps the most significant innovation of Luciano's empire was the establishment of a governing council, a concept that would later evolve into the infamous commission. This body was designed to mediate disputes, allocate territories, and enforce rules across the various mafia families. It was a revolutionary idea. Rather than leaving power struggles to personal vendettas, Luciano institutionalized governance, creating a framework for cooperation and conflict resolution. This approach reduced internecine warfare and stabilized the underworld in ways that had previously seemed impossible. By doing so, he not only enhanced his own power but also laid the foundation for a system that would endure long after his exile, influencing organized crime across the United States. Yet building an empire was not without its challenges. Rival factions viewed his consolidation with suspicion, law enforcement scrutinized his every move, and the delicate balance of alliances required constant attention. Luciano's genius lay in anticipating threats before they materialized. He used intelligence networks, informants, and meticulous observation to stay several steps ahead of both friends and foes. Decisions were never reactive. They were premeditated, calculated to maintain stability, maximize influence, and ensure survival. Each victory reinforced his authority, while each setback was transformed into a lesson that strengthened the empire's resilience. The psychological weight of power also demanded personal discipline. Luciano's life became a constant exercise in balance. Managing fear, inspiring loyalty, negotiating alliances, and maintaining personal influence without overexposure. The pressures were immense, and failure could mean not only financial loss but death. Yet this crucible forged a leader capable of unprecedented vision, blending strategic foresight with human insight in ways that few could replicate. His empire was not simply a product of brutality, it was a testament to intellect, adaptability, and the mastery of human dynamics. By the early 1930s, Luciano's vision had been realized. A centralized, highly organized criminal network that dominated New York and influenced operations nationwide. He had transformed chaos into order, violence into strategy, and ambition into empire. Every component, from alliances and territorial control to business diversification and psychological manipulation, worked in concert to sustain his dominance. What made his rise remarkable was not merely the accumulation of power but the methodology behind it, a combination of intelligence, foresight, and ruthlessness that redefined the very nature of organized crime. In this period, Luciano's empire became more than a network of crime. It became a symbol of calculated authority. It demonstrated that power could be engineered, managed, and institutionalized. It revealed how one man, guided by vision and psychological insight, could reshape an entire underworld, imposing order on chaos while navigating the treacherous currents of ambition, fear, and betrayal. The foundations he built would endure, influencing generations of mobsters and establishing a blueprint for organized crime in America. At the heart of Luciano's empire lay not just money, violence, or territorial control, but a deeper, more intangible force, the code of silence, known as omerta. To outsiders it was a simple rule: never cooperate with authorities, never betray the family, but in reality, it was a complex psychological and social framework that defined loyalty, fear, and survival within the mafia. Omerta was more than a guideline, it was a moral universe, a philosophy that dictated behavior, punished disloyalty, and rewarded those who understood its subtle yet uncompromising rules. For Luciano, mastery of this code was not optional, it was the foundation upon which every alliance, operation, and strategy rested. It was both shield and weapon, binding men together while keeping the machinery of crime in motion. Understanding omerta requires examining its dual nature. On one hand, it demanded silence in the face of law enforcement. To speak, to betray, to implicate a comrade was to forfeit protection and invite retribution. The consequences were often fatal, and the rule created a culture of fear that reinforced loyalty far more effectively than persuasion alone. On the other hand, omerta was a contract of trust, an unspoken agreement between men that transcended mere legality. It governed interactions, shaped alliances, and served as the invisible glue holding a sprawling criminal network together. To Luciano, this psychological framework was essential. He knew that even the most meticulously structured empire could crumble if the human element, loyalty, fear, and trust, was ignored. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to manipulate this code with nuance. He understood that omerta was not an abstract principle, but a living, breathing tool of power. By rewarding loyalty and subtly punishing defiance, he created a system where compliance was voluntary yet absolute. Men were not coerced into obedience blindly, they were shown the benefits of alignment and the costs of deviation. In this way, fear was not arbitrary, it was calculated, precise, and psychologically potent. Allies felt both the security of protection and the peril of betrayal, creating a balance that maintained cohesion without overt oppression. Omerta also served as a lens through which to view the psychology of betrayal. Luciano recognized that ambition, pride, and fear were constant forces in the underworld, capable of undermining even the most carefully constructed alliances. By embedding the principles of loyalty and secrecy into the very culture of his empire, he minimized the risk that personal ambition would escalate into open revolt. Those who challenged the rules were not merely punished for disobedience. They were removed in ways that reinforced the authority of the system itself. This blend of moral and practical enforcement allowed him to manage men far more complex than mere subordinates, each a self-interested actor whose choices could either fortify or destabilize the empire. The code of omerta extended beyond loyalty to the family, it was intertwined with reputation, perception, and psychological control. A man's honor was measured by adherence to the code, and this honor carried tangible value in both personal and professional contexts. Breaking omerta could mean isolation, loss of respect, or violent reprisal, while compliance guaranteed not just survival but status and trust. Luciano exploited this system with sophistication, ensuring that men understood that loyalty was not abstract, it was practical. Those who adhered were rewarded with opportunity, influence, and protection. Those who wavered were reminded, often violently, that the rules were immutable. Psychologically, omerta created a heightened state of vigilance and awareness. Every conversation, every transaction, every interaction carried risk. Luciano understood this intuitively. He trained his lieutenants, associates, and allies to think in terms of consequences, teaching them to anticipate threats, assess loyalty, and act decisively. In doing so, he transformed a simple moral code into a strategic framework, one that governed behavior, minimized risk, and maximized operational efficiency. The empire functioned not solely because of money or muscle, but because human behavior was guided by an intricate system of expectation, fear, and reward. Omerta also had a psychological ripple effect on those outside the mafia. Law enforcement, politicians, and journalists quickly learned that intimidation, secrecy, and loyalty made prosecution extraordinarily difficult. Witnesses vanished, evidence disappeared, and those who attempted to breach the code often paid with their lives. The aura of inviolability that surrounded the mafia was as much psychological as it was structural. For Luciano, this perception of untouchability amplified power. Fear became a tool, loyalty a currency, and silence a weapon that could paralyze even the most determined adversaries. Yet the code was not static, it evolved under Luciano's influence. He understood that the rigid enforcement of tradition could create resentment, rebellion, or inefficiency. To sustain long-term stability, he combined the moral weight of omerta with pragmatism, allowing for negotiation, selective enforcement, and strategic exceptions when necessary. This adaptability distinguished his leadership. He was not a tyrant enforcing rules blindly. He was a strategist, applying omerta as a flexible instrument that served the overarching goal of empire building. The emotional resonance of omerta was profound. It demanded constant psychological negotiation, requiring men to balance personal ambition with collective responsibility. It instilled a sense of identity and belonging, but also a pervasive tension, a constant awareness that missteps could be fatal. Luciano's mastery of this dynamic allowed him to manipulate not only actions but perceptions, creating an environment in which loyalty was both voluntary and inevitable. The code became a mirror of his own approach to power, precise, calculated, and profoundly aware of human nature. Ultimately, omerta was more than a rule, it was the psychological backbone of Luciano's empire. It enabled him to command vast networks of men, maintain cohesion across a fragmented underworld, and neutralize threats without destabilizing the system. Through fear, respect, and subtle manipulation, he ensured that loyalty was secured not merely by force but by the structure of human expectation itself. In the end, the code of silence was not just about secrecy, it was about control, perception, and the mastery of the human mind. For Luciano, omerta was not an obstacle to power, it was the engine that made his power possible, the invisible thread that bound ambition, strategy, and survival into a cohesive, enduring empire. Luciano's genius as a criminal architect was not merely in consolidating power or enforcing loyalty, it lay equally in his understanding of crime as business. The underworld was no longer a chaotic tangle of street gangs and violent skirmishes, it was an ecosystem of opportunity, where money, influence, and information flowed in patterns as complex as any legal enterprise. Luciano approached it with the precision of a CEO, recognizing that the key to lasting dominance was diversification, efficiency, and strategic risk management. Where others saw only chaos, he saw markets to control, systems to optimize, and human behavior to manipulate. In this way, his empire was as much a corporate network as it was a criminal syndicate, blending profit, fear, and power in a way that had never been attempted before. At the heart of this business model were the vice operations that formed the backbone of his empire: gambling, prostitution, narcotics, and labor rackets. Each venture was carefully planned, managed, and protected, with chains of command designed to isolate risk. Gambling dens were not just illicit entertainment, they were revenue-generating centers with meticulously enforced rules, controlled territory, and carefully selected staff. Profits flowed upward through a hierarchy that rewarded loyalty and punished incompetence. Similarly, prostitution rings were organized with the same precision, blending intimidation with protection, coercion with management, ensuring that operations remained profitable while minimizing exposure to law enforcement. Even narcotics, an inherently high-risk trade, was approached with strategic calculation, where alliances and controlled distribution mitigated potential fallout. Luciano's approach demonstrated a rare understanding. Crime was not merely about theft or violence, but about creating sustainable, scalable systems that could withstand both internal and external pressure. Labor racketeering in particular illustrates Luciano's sophisticated approach. By infiltrating unions and controlling labor disputes, he could exert influence over entire industries. Strikes, negotiations, and contracts became tools to extract profit, sway politicians, and manipulate markets. Here, Luciano's genius extended beyond brute force. He applied psychological insight, negotiation skills, and long-term planning to operations that would have seemed impenetrable to outsiders. Through these methods, the mafia became embedded not only in illicit markets but also in legitimate social and economic systems, blurring the line between legality and criminality. It was a bold, audacious expansion of power that relied as much on strategy as on intimidation. The psychological sophistication of Luciano's operations cannot be overstated. Every associate, employee, or ally understood the stakes of their involvement. Loyalty was reinforced not just through fear, but through opportunity. Those who performed well were rewarded with wealth, protection, and prestige. Those who faltered, or dared to challenge authority, faced swift and often brutal consequences. This combination of carrot and stick created a workforce that was both disciplined and motivated, capable of operating complex networks with minimal oversight. Luciano understood that human behavior could be engineered, that fear and ambition could be harnessed as tools to maintain order, and that perception could be as powerful as action in controlling a vast empire. Gambling operations, for instance, were more than illicit dens of chance. They were finely tuned systems of surveillance, bookkeeping, and influence. Luciano installed trusted lieutenants to manage operations, ensuring that profits were accurately recorded and distributed. He maintained a careful balance between visible enforcement and invisible oversight, cultivating an environment where customers felt excitement and allure, while competitors and law enforcement recognized the cost of intrusion. Every dice roll, every card game was an opportunity for profit and influence, a lesson in the duality of power and subtle control. Prostitution rings similarly reflected Luciano's strategic thinking. Women were often recruited, managed, and protected in ways that maximized both income and operational security. Relationships with local officials, police, and influential community figures were carefully cultivated to ensure the operations ran with minimal interference. At the same time, the personal safety and loyalty of those involved was enforced through a mixture of fear, respect, and subtle negotiation, demonstrating a balance between ruthless pragmatism and strategic oversight. For Luciano, these enterprises were not merely about money, they were about control, about embedding influence in every facet of society, and about creating a network that extended beyond the obvious boundaries of crime. Narcotics trafficking, perhaps the riskiest of all ventures, illustrates Luciano's calculated audacity. While others might be blinded by potential profit or thrill, he approached the trade with careful risk assessment and contingency planning. Distribution networks were compartmentalized, alliances with other criminal entities were strategically negotiated, and enforcement actions were carefully weighed. The psychological stakes were high. Mistrust could lead to betrayal, competition could erupt into violence, and law enforcement pressure was relentless. Luciano's success lay in his ability to combine operational efficiency with human insight, turning a potentially chaotic enterprise into a manageable, profitable system. Beyond individual enterprises, Luciano understood the importance of information as currency. Intelligence networks allowed him to anticipate threats, track rivals, and negotiate advantageous deals. Knowledge of law enforcement activity, rival movements, and market conditions became as valuable as money, enabling him to act with foresight while others reacted impulsively. In this way, Luciano's empire operated like a sophisticated organization, where human capital, operational precision, and strategic intelligence converged to create unparalleled power. Perhaps the most striking aspect of Luciano's approach was his ability to normalize criminal enterprise, blending coercion with legitimacy. By creating structures that mirrored lawful organizations, hierarchies, accounting, disciplined operations, he insulated his empire from chaos while enhancing its appearance of control. To employees, allies, and even adversaries, Luciano projected authority, competence, and inevitability. Every operation was both profitable and psychologically compelling, reinforcing the idea that the mafia was not merely a criminal entity, but a sophisticated, enduring institution capable of influencing society at multiple levels. Luciano's manipulation of vice operations also reflected his deep understanding of timing and opportunity. Prohibition may have ended, but the appetite for illicit entertainment, gambling, and vice had not diminished. If anything, it had grown. Luciano seized on this social and economic shift, identifying niches where influence could be exerted and profit maximized. He exploited gaps in law enforcement oversight, leveraged political connections, and applied the psychological principles of fear and loyalty to maintain control. In doing so, he transformed vice from chaotic, localized crime into a structured, empire-wide system, embedding himself and his organization at the center of opportunity. Ultimately, the business of crime under Luciano was a marriage of strategy, psychology, and audacity. It was a world in which profit, influence, and loyalty intersected with human behavior, risk, and perception. The empire he built was resilient because it was designed with intelligence, foresight, and discipline, and because he understood the human element as deeply as he understood the financial or structural. In Luciano's hands, crime became more than survival. It became an enterprise, a system, and a platform for power that extended beyond immediate transactions to influence society, politics, and the very perception of authority. The sophistication of Luciano's vice operations was a harbinger of modern organized crime. It demonstrated that power could be engineered through careful planning, human insight, and diversified enterprise. It showed that fear and loyalty could be harnessed as tools, and that strategic intelligence could outweigh brute force in shaping outcomes. Above all, it revealed the mind of a man who understood that criminality, like any business, required structure, foresight, and an unerring understanding of the people who inhabited the world he sought to control. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's empire had grown into a formidable machine, sprawling across neighborhoods, industries, and illicit markets. Yet power, even when meticulously engineered, is never absolute. Every empire carries its own fragility, hidden in the ambitions, resentments, and fears of those who inhabit it. Allies could turn to rivals in a heartbeat, rivals could form coalitions to challenge authority, and the ever-present eyes of law enforcement added an invisible, suffocating pressure. For Luciano, navigating this treacherous terrain required the same strategic insight he applied to operations and finances, understanding psychology, calculating risk, and anticipating human behavior with uncanny precision. His genius lay not only in amassing power but in managing it, balancing the ambitions of allies, neutralizing the threats of rivals, and manipulating perceptions to maintain control. Allies were the foundation of Luciano's strength, yet they were far from simple. Men like Meyer Lansky, who brought both loyalty and intellect, were indispensable in the management of complex operations, particularly in the realm of finance and gambling. Lansky's calm, calculating approach complemented Luciano's dynamic, assertive style, creating a partnership that extended beyond mere convenience into strategic brilliance. Similarly, other lieutenants, each with unique skills and networks, were carefully integrated into the empire's structure. Luciano's understanding of loyalty was psychological as much as practical. He rewarded competence, ambition, and discretion, creating a system in which allies were motivated to perform at their best while remaining aware of the consequences of disloyalty. Through this delicate balancing act, he converted potentially volatile human relationships into predictable, manageable assets. Rivals, however, presented a constant challenge. Figures such as Vito Genovese, who was ambitious and cunning in his own right, tested the boundaries of loyalty and hierarchy. Luciano understood that unchecked ambition within his ranks could destabilize the entire organization, and he moved swiftly to manage threats before they could escalate into open conflict. Rivalries were rarely resolved through brute force alone. Instead, Luciano employed negotiation, persuasion, and, when necessary, intimidation. He created a framework in which potential adversaries could either align with the empire's vision or face isolation. This psychological sophistication, reading intentions, predicting moves, and shaping outcomes, was as crucial to his leadership as any financial or operational decision. The interplay between allies and rivals also highlighted the precariousness of trust in the underworld. Every alliance carried the potential for betrayal, every handshake a hidden threat. Luciano's understanding of this dynamic allowed him to manipulate relationships with a subtlety few could match. He cultivated dependence, built networks of obligation, and created interlocking interests that made defection costly. Simultaneously, he observed behaviors for signs of ambition, resentment, or hesitation, ready to act decisively if loyalty wavered. The ability to blend encouragement, subtle manipulation, and decisive action became a defining feature of his leadership, transforming the volatile landscape of the underworld into a controllable, predictable system, though never one without tension. Psychologically, betrayal was both a danger and a tool. Luciano recognized that fear of retribution could be harnessed to reinforce loyalty, but that ambition and resentment could undermine even the most carefully constructed alliances. He studied human behavior with the precision of a scientist, noting patterns in speech, gesture, and decision-making that hinted at underlying intentions. In doing so, he could preempt challenges, isolate threats, and redirect energy in ways that strengthened his control. Allies who might have been tempted to defect were either reassured with rewards, intimidated into compliance, or removed altogether. Rivals were simultaneously constrained by fear and opportunity, creating a delicate equilibrium in which loyalty was voluntary yet inexorably reinforced by circumstance and perception. The delicate balance of power also extended to family dynamics within the mafia itself. Luciano's vision of organization required that each family operate semi-autonomously, yet under overarching coordination. This structure allowed for efficiency and scalability, but it also created friction. Family leaders had their own ambitions, priorities, and interpretations of loyalty, and managing these personalities demanded constant vigilance. Luciano navigated this landscape with a combination of diplomacy and authority, ensuring that the hierarchy remained intact while allowing for initiative and entrepreneurship within defined boundaries. The result was an empire capable of both centralized coordination and decentralized adaptability, a revolutionary achievement in the criminal world. Betrayal, when it occurred, was never merely punished, it was leveraged. Luciano understood that fear could be as strategic as force, and that the perception of inevitability was as powerful as any action. When a subordinate or ally defected, their removal sent a message to the entire network, reinforcing the rules of loyalty and obedience without destabilizing operations. This psychological management was critical. It allowed Luciano to maintain authority over men who were ambitious, intelligent, and potentially volatile, turning human frailty into a tool for organizational stability. The calculated use of fear, reputation, and perception became a hallmark of his leadership, ensuring that control extended beyond immediate oversight and into the minds of those who served or opposed him. The world of alliances and rivalries was further complicated by the evolving political and social landscape. Law enforcement scrutiny was intensifying, public perception of organized crime was shifting, and wartime pressures created both risk and opportunity. Luciano's ability to navigate this multidimensional environment, balancing internal loyalty, external threats, and social perception, required an extraordinary blend of intelligence, foresight, and psychological insight. Allies and rivals alike had to be managed not only for operational success, but for long-term stability and influence, ensuring that the empire remained resilient in the face of constant turbulence. Even within the framework of his own organization, Luciano understood that unpredictability could be an asset. By creating a culture in which loyalty was measured, tested, and rewarded, he kept associates alert and engaged, reducing complacency and strengthening the network's adaptability. Simultaneously, by maintaining visibility into the intentions and behaviors of rivals, he could exploit weaknesses, orchestrate strategic moves, and consolidate power without unnecessary conflict. This continuous negotiation of human behavior, anticipating ambition, tempering resentment, and reinforcing allegiance, was the invisible machinery that sustained his empire, complementing the structural and financial innovations that had already set him apart. In essence, the world of allies, rivals, and betrayal was a psychological battlefield, as critical to Luciano's success as any criminal enterprise. The human element, trust, fear, ambition, loyalty, was both a vulnerability and a resource. His ability to understand, predict, and manipulate these forces allowed him to navigate the treacherous terrain of organized crime with unmatched skill. Where others saw chaos, he saw leverage. Where others saw threats, he saw opportunity. Through careful observation, strategic manipulation, and decisive action, Luciano turned a volatile web of relationships into a disciplined, functioning network capable of sustaining an empire. Ultimately, the interplay between allies and rivals, loyalty and betrayal, fear and ambition, defined the character of Luciano's empire. It was a world in which human behavior was as critical to success as money, territory, or violence. The psychological sophistication required to manage such a network was extraordinary, and Luciano's mastery of it set him apart from every other figure in the underworld. This delicate dance of trust and tension, reward and punishment, ambition and compliance, ensured that his empire remained resilient, adaptive, and enduring, at least until forces beyond human control would eventually challenge it. Beneath the surface of Luciano's carefully constructed empire simmered a war few outsiders could see, a hidden war of strategy, influence, and survival that unfolded in back rooms, smoky offices, and shadowed streets. This was not the overt violence of gunfights or street brawls, though those were never far away. It was a war waged in whispers, in subtle maneuvers, in alliances formed and broken before the public even realized they existed. For Luciano, understanding this hidden battlefield was as critical as managing profits or enforcing loyalty. The underworld, like any ecosystem of power, was alive with tension, and those who misread its signals often found themselves on the losing side. The first front in this hidden war was internal. Rivalries within the mafia that threatened to destabilize the empire from within. Even as Luciano consolidated control, ambitious lieutenants and family heads tested boundaries, eager to carve out influence or expand territory. These challenges were rarely direct. They were calculated moves, subtle displays of autonomy or power meant to gauge response. Luciano's response had to be equally nuanced. Force alone could provoke backlash, inaction could invite chaos. He relied on intelligence networks, careful observation, and psychological insight to preempt rebellion, using negotiation, incentive, and, when necessary, decisive elimination to maintain equilibrium. Every decision was a calculated gambit, each action a signal to allies and rivals alike that loyalty was both expected and rewarded, but dissent would not be tolerated. External pressures compounded the challenge. Law enforcement, emboldened by new investigations and public outcry, was increasingly focused on organized crime. Federal agents, local police, and political figures sought to disrupt operations through arrests, raids, and surveillance. For Luciano, this was a game of anticipation. He needed to predict moves before they happened, protect his empire without revealing vulnerability, and manipulate outcomes to his advantage. Allies could serve as buffers, informants could be neutralized, and public perception could be shaped to reduce exposure. The war was psychological as much as operational. The mere perception of control could prevent escalation, deter rivals, and maintain dominance. Complicating matters further was the shifting landscape of power during World War II. The conflict drew resources and attention away from domestic policing, creating both opportunity and risk. Smuggling networks flourished under wartime scarcity, yet government oversight was unpredictable and occasionally intrusive. Luciano saw opportunity where others saw danger, offering support to intelligence efforts while simultaneously safeguarding his empire. His controversial cooperation with authorities, particularly in securing shipping and port access, demonstrated his ability to navigate complex, high-stakes environments. It was a masterclass in strategic diplomacy. By aligning with government interests when convenient, he could both protect his operations and subtly expand influence, all while maintaining the appearance of detachment. This hidden war was not only about survival, it was about shaping the future of organized crime. Luciano's vision extended beyond immediate profit or territorial control. He sought to stabilize the underworld, create systems that minimized internecine conflict, and impose a hierarchy that allowed for both coordination and individual initiative. Every alliance formed, every rival neutralized, every negotiation conducted was a move toward a larger strategic objective: the creation of a criminal ecosystem that could endure beyond the volatility of individual personalities or fleeting power struggles. In this sense, the hidden war was both tactical and visionary, blending immediate responses with long-term planning. Psychologically, the stakes were immense. Every ally was a potential threat, every rival a possible disruption. Decision-making required an acute understanding of human nature, the desires, fears, and ambitions that motivated behavior. Luciano's skill lay in anticipating not just actions but reactions, in managing perception as carefully as reality. A well-timed reward could secure loyalty, a calculated threat could reinforce obedience. Misdirection, subtle intimidation, and strategic communication became weapons in a conflict where visibility often equaled vulnerability. Success in this hidden war demanded constant vigilance, foresight, and the ability to manipulate both opportunity and fear simultaneously. One of the most striking aspects of this period was the interplay between visible violence and invisible strategy. Street-level conflicts, shootings, intimidation, and enforcement were often symptoms of larger strategic battles that most observers could not perceive. A minor skirmish could be a warning, a test of loyalty, or a diversion while critical negotiations unfolded elsewhere. Luciano recognized that appearances could be deceiving and that controlling perception was as critical as controlling territory. By orchestrating events to influence both allies and rivals, he maintained dominance without always resorting to overt confrontation, turning chaos into opportunity and ambiguity into a tool of control. The hidden war also involved constant assessment of shifting loyalties. Allies could be swayed by promises, threats, or the allure of independent power. Rivals could exploit divisions to mount challenges. Luciano's approach combined surveillance, intelligence gathering, and psychological manipulation, allowing him to anticipate and counter threats before they crystallized into open conflict. The goal was to maintain stability without stifling initiative, to allow growth and ambition while controlling the parameters in which such ambition could operate safely. It was a delicate balance, requiring not only tactical skill but an extraordinary understanding of human motivation and behavior. Furthermore, the hidden war was fueled by information as much as by force. Knowledge of rival movements, law enforcement priorities, and internal sentiment was invaluable. Luciano's networks functioned as both radar and shield, providing insight into threats while enabling preemptive action. Every conversation, transaction, or subtle gesture could contain intelligence. Every ally and subordinate became a node in a sprawling network of observation. This constant flow of information allowed Luciano to act decisively, converting what might appear as random events into predictable patterns and manageable risk. Ultimately, the hidden war demonstrates that power is never absolute, and that the strength of an empire lies as much in its management of human psychology as in its accumulation of wealth or territory. Luciano's ability to anticipate moves, manipulate perception, and enforce loyalty without relying solely on overt violence ensured that his empire remained resilient in the face of constant internal and external pressure. This period illuminates the delicate, invisible machinery that sustains power, a complex interplay of fear, loyalty, ambition, intelligence, and strategy. By the time Luciano faced the events that would eventually lead to his arrest and exile, the hidden war had already exacted its toll. Allies had been tested, rivals neutralized, and the empire maintained, but the psychological and operational strain was immense. Survival required vigilance at all times. Miscalculation could result in death, betrayal, or collapse. It was a world in which the stakes were existential, where every decision carried consequences far beyond the immediate moment, and where the line between dominance and disaster was razor-thin. In the shadows of this hidden war, Luciano's mastery of human behavior, strategy, and perception allowed him not only to survive but to thrive. The underworld was a battlefield in which violence was only one of many weapons. Insight, manipulation, and foresight were often more decisive. By understanding the invisible forces at play, alliances, rivalries, loyalties, and betrayals, he could orchestrate outcomes with a precision that few could challenge. This period stands as a testament to the psychological brilliance underlying his empire, revealing that the true power of Luciano was as much cerebral as it was territorial or financial. No empire, no matter how meticulously constructed, is impervious to collapse, and for Luciano the fall began not with fanfare, but with the subtle erosion of control. The very systems he had built, alliances, networks, and psychological leverage, were vulnerable to forces both internal and external. Years of dominance had created enemies who had waited patiently for a crack in his armor, while law enforcement, emboldened by public scrutiny and political pressure, had begun to tighten their net. The hidden war that Luciano had so masterfully navigated now took on a new, more perilous dimension. Survival required the same foresight and calculation that had built the empire, yet the stakes were higher. Mistakes would no longer be recoverable and loyalty could no longer be guaranteed. The first fissures appeared quietly. Subordinates, once loyal, began chafing under the weight of rules and expectations, tempted by promises of independence or rewards from rivals. Even trusted allies became potential threats, driven by ambition, fear, or resentment. Luciano understood the psychology of betrayal better than anyone. He knew that ambition was a constant force, and loyalty could be fleeting if not actively maintained. Yet even his foresight had limits. As the pressures of law enforcement increased, as rival factions maneuvered behind the scenes, and as wartime politics complicated operations, cracks began to appear in the carefully maintained veneer of invincibility. Small miscalculations that once could be corrected now carried the potential for catastrophe. The legal pressure mounting against Luciano was relentless. Authorities were no longer content with piecemeal arrests or minor disruptions. They sought to dismantle the empire at its core. Investigations, surveillance, and indictments increasingly targeted the leadership itself, rather than foot soldiers or lieutenants. The strategy was designed to destabilize the organization by attacking its brain, and Luciano was acutely aware of the threat. Every meeting, every transaction, every alliance had to be reassessed through the lens of risk, and even the most trusted confidants became subjects of scrutiny. The empire he had built on loyalty and psychological control now faced an adversary that was persistent, methodical, and legally empowered in ways that force alone could not counter. Simultaneously, rival factions sensed vulnerability. Figures like Vito Genovese and others, who had long existed under Luciano's shadow, began making subtle moves to test boundaries and seize territory. Unlike the overt violence of earlier decades, these challenges were strategic, designed to undermine credibility, foment dissent, and weaken alliances from within. Luciano's mastery of psychology, which had previously allowed him to preempt rebellion, now faced the ultimate test: how to maintain loyalty and control when the very perception of power was under siege. Even a hint of weakness could cascade into chaos, and the underworld, ever sensitive to signals of vulnerability, responded with careful observation and opportunistic maneuvers. the fall also had a deeply personal dimension. For all his strategic brilliance, Luciano was human, subject to the same pressures, fatigue and misjudgment as anyone else. The constant vigilance required to manage alliances, enforce omerta, monitor rivals and navigate law enforcement was exhausting, and even a single lapse in judgment could prove fatal. Decisions that had once been executed with clarity and precision now carried heightened risk. The psychological weight of maintaining an empire in the face of coordinated opposition began to exact its toll, and the fall of Luciano's empire, though gradual, became increasingly inevitable. A turning point came with the mounting evidence and indictments targeting his operations. Investigators, emboldened by informants and cooperative witnesses, began to unravel the complex web of connections and transactions that had insulated Luciano's empire. Legal traps were set, surveillance networks intensified, and pressure was applied not only to Luciano but to his closest associates. The psychological game, once dominated by Luciano's manipulation, now shifted. The balance of fear, loyalty, and influence tilted toward a system that had the law on its side. Even men who had once been unflinchingly loyal faced difficult choices, torn between self-preservation and allegiance. Betrayal, long a latent threat within the empire, became manifest. Some associates, confronted with the risk of imprisonment or financial ruin, chose self-interest over loyalty. Others, sensing the decline in power, sought alliances with rivals or law enforcement. The very mechanisms Luciano had relied upon to maintain cohesion, fear, opportunity, and reputation, were now strained to the breaking point. Each defection, each misstep, amplified the vulnerability of the empire and eroded the psychological control that had been its lifeblood. What had once been a system of calculated obedience began to show signs of fragmentation, as men who had been disciplined and predictable now acted out of desperation, ambition, or fear. Luciano's arrest marked the visible beginning of the fall, but the true collapse had been set in motion long before the gavel fell. It was a cumulative process: the erosion of internal cohesion, the relentless pressure of law enforcement, the opportunistic maneuvers of rivals, and the psychological strain of sustaining dominance under increasingly adverse conditions. The empire, vast and resilient though it had been, was now exposed to forces beyond its control, and even Luciano's brilliance could not fully mitigate the mounting pressure. The fall, like the rise, was a study in human behavior, how loyalty can fracture, how ambition can override fear, and how perception can outweigh reality. Yet even in the midst of decline, Luciano's mastery of strategy and psychology remained evident. He attempted to mitigate losses, secure loyal allies, and negotiate terms that might preserve elements of his influence. The fall was not chaotic. It was calculated, deliberate, and strategic, reflecting the same meticulous approach that had defined his ascent. However, some forces, legal, social, and political, were beyond negotiation or control, and the very systems that had sustained the empire now became channels through which it unraveled. This phase of Luciano's life underscores a universal truth about power. No matter how carefully constructed, empires are fragile when exposed to internal and external pressures simultaneously. Success depends not only on vision and execution but on the ability to manage human behavior, anticipate threats, and navigate complex social, political, and psychological landscapes. Luciano's fall was a dramatic illustration of these dynamics. The genius that had built an empire now faced the stark reality that even brilliance has limits in the face of relentless opposition, shifting loyalties, and the inexorable mechanisms of justice. In the end, the fall of Luciano's empire was both inevitable and instructive. It revealed the delicate interplay of strategy, psychology, and circumstance that governs power, demonstrating that dominance is never static and control is always contingent. The cracks in the empire were not random. They were predictable, arising from the very forces that had shaped its rise: ambition, fear, loyalty, and the relentless drive for influence. Luciano's journey from dominance to vulnerability illustrates the human dimension of crime, power, and ambition, showing that even the most calculated, brilliant leaders are subject to the shifting currents of circumstance, perception, and human behavior. The trial of Lucky Luciano was more than a legal proceeding. It was the dramatic theater of a man who had dominated the underworld finally brought into the glaring light of public scrutiny. From the outside, it seemed almost inevitable that a figure of his notoriety would face the courts, yet the psychological tension, the stakes, and the spectacle elevated it far beyond ordinary criminal cases. The courtroom became a battleground where reputation, perception, and strategy played as critical a role as evidence and testimony. Luciano, who had spent decades mastering influence and human behavior, now confronted a system that sought not only to punish but to publicly dismantle his power, a stage that would test his psychological resilience as severely as any street-level conflict. From the start, the trial was a media sensation. Newspapers splashed headlines across city streets, framing Luciano as both a modern-day outlaw and the embodiment of moral corruption. The press, eager for spectacle, painted vivid narratives of organized crime, violence, and vice, shaping public perception even before the first witness took the stand. For Luciano, this was an environment he understood but could not fully control. The psychological pressure of being observed, judged, and vilified on multiple fronts was immense, yet he maintained the composure and calculated detachment that had defined his life. Every gesture, every word, and every glance carried weight, an unspoken negotiation of perception and influence within a courtroom now filled with both supporters and adversaries. The prosecution's case was meticulously constructed, weaving together witness testimony, financial records, and accounts of illegal operations. The charges, ranging from involvement in prostitution rings to labor racketeering, represented the culmination of years of investigation, surveillance, and intelligence gathering by law enforcement. Yet despite the depth and breadth of evidence, the trial was as much psychological warfare as legal argument. Witnesses were pressured, alliances tested, and credibility challenged. Every participant understood that a misstep could influence not only the outcome for Luciano, but the broader perception of the mafia and organized crime in America. For Luciano, the courtroom was a landscape of both risk and opportunity. He applied the same psychological insight that had guided his rise, reading the intentions, fears, and weaknesses of jurors, lawyers, and witnesses alike. Subtle expressions, hesitations, and tonal inflections were noted and catalogued. Every interaction became a piece of a larger puzzle, a way to influence perception without overtly breaking protocol or decorum. His strategic thinking extended beyond legal maneuvering. It encompassed the realm of human behavior itself, where influence and intimidation operated as effectively as evidence. The defense, aware of the stakes, employed tactics designed to cast doubt, create ambiguity, and exploit gaps in the prosecution's narrative. Luciano's prior reputation both helped and hindered this strategy. His carefully cultivated persona as a charismatic, intelligent, and methodical leader could elicit respect or fear, but it also made him a target for those eager to see justice meted out. The courtroom thus became a stage on which the duality of his life, master of manipulation, genius of strategy, was exposed for public judgment, every nuance dissected and interpreted by jurors, press, and onlookers. Underlying the trial was a broader social and political context that intensified its significance. Public outrage over organized crime, coupled with political ambitions to demonstrate effective law enforcement, created an environment in which conviction was not merely desired but demanded. Judges, prosecutors, and police operated under immense scrutiny, and their actions carried consequences far beyond the courtroom. Luciano's empire, which had long operated in shadows, was now being evaluated under the bright, unforgiving lights of legality and morality. The psychological tension was magnified by this exposure. Every statement, objection, and response carried implications for public perception, the loyalty of allies, and the fate of the empire itself. Psychologically, the trial tested Luciano's resilience. Years of control over environments, alliances, and human behavior could not eliminate the unpredictability of a jury, the pressure of public scrutiny, or the complexities of legal strategy. He had to navigate these challenges while maintaining composure, projecting confidence, and subtly influencing perception. The stakes were profound. A conviction would dismantle his empire, sever his control, and expose vulnerabilities that had been carefully hidden for decades. Yet even under this immense pressure, Luciano's strategic mind remained active, calculating outcomes, anticipating moves, and positioning himself in ways designed to mitigate damage and preserve influence. The proceedings also illuminated the role of betrayal and shifting loyalties within the underworld. Some witnesses, whether coerced or motivated by self-preservation, provided testimony that threatened to unravel the carefully maintained networks of protection and silence. Allies had to weigh their own survival against the implicit codes of loyalty that had governed their lives. For Luciano, each piece of testimony, each declaration, was a variable in a larger psychological equation. Managing this dynamic required precision, timing, and insight, demonstrating once again that human behavior, fear, ambition, loyalty, was as critical to his empire as any operational or financial decision. The verdict, when it finally came, was a mixture of consequence and spectacle. Conviction on multiple charges reflected both the thoroughness of law enforcement and the symbolic weight of bringing a figure like Luciano to justice. Yet even in sentencing, the psychological interplay continued. How the empire would react, how rivals would position themselves, and how public perception would evolve all remained factors in an ongoing, invisible war. Luciano's fall from the courtroom podium mirrored the collapse of internal cohesion within the empire, yet his strategic mind had already begun to consider avenues for influence, negotiation, and survival beyond the immediate defeat. The trial of Lucky Luciano stands as a dramatic intersection of law, psychology, and power. It illustrates how influence, perception, and strategic thinking operate under intense pressure, and how even the most meticulously constructed empire is vulnerable when subjected to coordinated scrutiny. It underscores the duality of Luciano himself, a man capable of extraordinary brilliance and ruthless ambition, yet also subject to forces beyond his control. The courtroom became both battlefield and stage, a place where human behavior, societal pressure, and institutional authority converged to test the limits of loyalty, strategy, and resilience. In the end, the trial was more than a legal judgment. It was a crucible of psychological, social, and operational forces. Luciano's conviction marked the formal beginning of his decline, yet it also highlighted the enduring genius that had built his empire, the capacity to read people, anticipate threats, manipulate perception, and navigate complex social structures. The courtroom, with its intense scrutiny, shifting loyalties, and symbolic stakes, revealed not only the vulnerabilities of power, but also the extraordinary skill required to construct and maintain it. It was a public reckoning for a private genius, a testament to the complex interplay of ambition, strategy, and human behavior that defined the life of one of the most influential figures in organized crime history. Even behind the cold, imposing walls of prison, Lucky Luciano's mind remained free, his influence undiminished. While most might imagine incarceration as a total loss of power, for Luciano it became another arena, a controlled environment where his understanding of psychology, perception, and strategy could be applied in new and subtle ways. The streets outside may have been beyond his immediate reach, but within the confines of a penitentiary, he discovered that human behavior could still be influenced, loyalty could still be cultivated, and an empire could, in a sense, continue to operate through proxies and networks. This period demonstrated that Luciano's genius was not tied solely to freedom of movement or physical dominance. It was in his ability to shape the actions and perceptions of others, even under extreme constraint. The prison environment was one of constant negotiation and observation. Guards, fellow inmates, and external associates all represented variables in a complex social system that Luciano learned to manipulate with precision. By understanding motivations, fear, ambition, respect, he could create alliances, manage rivalries, and maintain a degree of authority despite the restrictive conditions. In some cases, relationships with prison officials were carefully cultivated, leveraging influence to improve conditions or gain strategic advantages. Within this microcosm, Luciano applied the same principles he had used to control his empire: intelligence, foresight, and psychological insight, demonstrating that true power is as much about perception and influence as it is about territory or wealth. Even more remarkably, Luciano managed to exert influence beyond prison walls. Through letters, intermediaries, and carefully positioned associates, he continued to oversee operations, guide decision-making, and protect the interests of his organization. Communication was selective and coded, designed to avoid detection while transmitting instructions with clarity and authority. Each message was a tool, reinforcing loyalty, asserting control, and subtly reminding subordinates that power was maintained through his guidance, even in absence. In this way, Luciano's incarceration became a study in indirect influence, showing that leadership is as much about psychological presence as it is about physical presence. The psychological landscape of prison also offered lessons in human behavior and control. Inmates, like associates in the empire, were motivated by opportunity, fear, and ambition. Luciano's ability to read these cues, predict reactions, and subtly manipulate outcomes allowed him to create a network of influence even among those who might have seemed adversarial. Respect, intimidation, and strategic generosity became instruments of control, ensuring that alliances were formed and maintained despite physical limitations. Each interaction, however small, was calculated to reinforce authority, maintain loyalty, and extend influence into the broader underworld. One of the key challenges Luciano faced behind bars was the preservation of his organizational structure. Absence from the streets risked fragmentation, rebellion, or opportunistic moves by rivals. To counter this, Luciano relied on intermediaries, trusted lieutenants who understood his strategy, maintained operational discipline, and executed orders in alignment with his vision. These proxies functioned as extensions of his authority, ensuring continuity and stability despite the disruption of his physical removal. The psychological principle at work was clear. Control is maintained not only by direct supervision, but by embedding trust, expectation, and structured hierarchy into the system itself. Luciano also understood the importance of timing and perception while incarcerated. He cultivated an image of composed, calculating leadership, projecting confidence even in circumstances designed to diminish influence. The perception of control, he knew, could reinforce obedience and deter opportunistic challenges. Those outside the prison walls, aware of his ongoing communication and guidance, were reminded that the empire was resilient, that authority persisted, and that defiance carried both immediate and long-term risk. Psychological dominance, in this context, became a tool as potent as any operational directive. It shaped behavior, reinforced loyalty, and maintained stability. The relationship between prison influence and street operations revealed Luciano's strategic sophistication. By maintaining communication and oversight, he ensured that his empire could continue functioning efficiently, making decisions, resolving disputes, and maximizing profit even in his absence. Subordinates internalized his principles, operational protocols, and strategic priorities, creating a system that could operate semi-autonomously yet remain aligned with his vision. This reflects a fundamental insight into leadership. True power is as much about creating resilient systems as it is about direct control, and Luciano applied this principle with extraordinary precision. Psychologically, incarceration also offered a testing ground for control under pressure. Threats, rivalries, and unpredictable conditions were magnified within the confines of prison. Every encounter required careful calculation. Every alliance required validation. Every act of defiance had to be anticipated and countered. Luciano's ability to navigate this microcosm mirrored the strategies he had employed across decades of criminal enterprise. Anticipate human behavior, manipulate perception, and maintain authority through a combination of fear, respect, and strategic reward. The prison walls, far from confining him, became a laboratory for the principles of power he had long mastered. Perhaps most striking was the way Luciano used incarceration to solidify his long-term legacy. By ensuring that his empire remained functional, that key alliances were preserved, and that influence extended beyond physical confinement, he demonstrated that power is resilient when built upon psychological insight, operational discipline, and strategic foresight. The empire's survival, even amid legal disruption, validated the structures he had created, the loyalty he had cultivated, and the influence he had exerted over decades of careful planning. In this sense, prison became not merely a punishment, but a stage on which Luciano's mastery of human behavior, leadership, and strategy was further proven. In the broader narrative of Luciano's life, the period behind bars highlights a paradox of power. Physical freedom is not synonymous with influence, and constraint can sometimes amplify strategic ingenuity. Luciano's ability to navigate this environment, maintain authority, and extend his reach illustrates the depth of his understanding of human nature, psychology, and organizational dynamics. Control, he demonstrated, is less about brute force and more about perception, loyalty, and strategic foresight, a lesson that would echo through the history of organized crime long after his release. Ultimately, Luciano's period behind bars underscores the enduring principles that defined his life and empire: mastery of human behavior, strategic foresight, and the cultivation of loyalty through a delicate balance of fear, respect, and reward. Even when confined, his mind orchestrated operations, influenced decisions, and maintained stability, demonstrating that power is as much psychological as it is physical. Prison, in this context, was not the end of his influence, but a crucible in which the enduring genius of his leadership was both tested and affirmed. Exile is a peculiar punishment. It strips a man of territory, authority, and immediate power, yet cannot erase reputation, knowledge, or influence cultivated over decades. For Lucky Luciano, deportation to Italy in 1946 marked both a fall from grace and a new stage of reflection. Sent away from the empire he had meticulously built, he faced a world simultaneously familiar and alien. The streets of Naples were far removed from the alleys, nightclubs, and boardrooms of New York, yet exile offered an opportunity to confront the impermanence of power and to reassess the legacy of a life defined by ambition, control, and survival. The immediate impact of exile was disorienting. Luciano, accustomed to commanding loyalty and shaping events from the center of influence, suddenly found himself at the margins. Allies were distant, operational control was fractured, and rivals advanced agendas unchecked. Yet true to his strategic genius, Luciano did not succumb to despair. He understood that influence is not confined to proximity, it travels through networks, reputation, and psychological perception. Letters, intermediaries, and careful negotiation allowed him to maintain relevance, demonstrating that power is less about physical presence than about the ability to shape outcomes indirectly. Italy presented both practical and psychological challenges. Post-war Naples was fractured, politically unstable, and economically devastated. Mafia organizations in Sicily and Naples had histories, codes, and rivalries older and more entrenched than anything Luciano had encountered in America. Here he was no longer the unquestioned master. He was an outsider whose presence had to be negotiated. This period tested his adaptability, patience, and strategic foresight in ways no prison or underworld alliance ever had. Luciano had to navigate culture, politics, and historical legacies while recalibrating his approach to influence within a context he could not fully control. Yet Exile also offered perspective. Removed from the immediacy of crime and empire management, Luciano had space to reflect on patterns he had exploited, systems he had built, and mistakes that precipitated his fall. The contours of his genius became clearer. His empire had been as much psychological as structural, as much about perception as action. Exile underscored a fundamental lesson. Power is transient, human behavior is central to dominance, and influence can extend beyond presence if cultivated intelligently. His final years were marked by a recalibration of priorities. Gone were high-stakes confrontations with rivals, the orchestration of vice operations, and constant surveillance of alliances. In their place came deliberate, slower engagement, cultivating relationships, observing trends, and monitoring crime from a distance. This period revealed a philosophical transformation. The man who once sought total control began to recognize the limits of his reach, the inevitability of change, and the enduring power of intellect and reputation over brute force. Even in exile, Luciano's presence remained influential. Law enforcement and underworld figures alike monitored his actions, aware that his knowledge, connections, and reputation could shape outcomes subtly. His influence persisted, demonstrating that true dominance is as much psychological as structural. This period also prompted reflection on loyalty and betrayal, ambition and survival, revealing the fragility of human systems and the inevitability of decline. Exile ultimately redefined Luciano's understanding of power. Influence could be indirect, legacy could be operational, and survival could be intellectual rather than physical. He understood that control lies in perception, reputation, and the strategic management of human behavior. His life in Naples became a quiet testament to his genius, a stage on which the principles of power he had mastered could be observed in their purest form. In the broader arc of his life, Exile represents the convergence of rise, fall, and reflection. Ambition met consequence, strategy met limitation, and human behavior revealed both the possibilities and constraints of influence. Luciano's journey from New York streets to Naples' exile encapsulates the arc of power, accumulation, exercise, and ultimate transformation into legacy. Even in the absence of empire, his mind remained a force, shaping perception, understanding human nature, and demonstrating that the architecture of power is as enduring as the intellect that constructs it. Lucky Luciano's influence on organized crime extends far beyond his lifetime. He transformed a fragmented, violent underworld into a structured, strategic enterprise, creating the commission to mediate disputes and coordinate operations among rival families. This system reduced chaos, reinforced loyalty, and allowed organized crime to function like a corporation, demonstrating that dominance depends not only on force but on psychological insight, perception, and strategic foresight. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to manipulate human behavior, anticipating ambition, channeling loyalty, and deterring betrayal. His psychological sophistication made him a leader who could orchestrate vast networks even in the absence of immediate presence. Culturally, Luciano became the archetype of the modern mobster, intelligent, ruthless, and charismatic. Stories of his life permeated newspapers, books, and films, shaping public imagination and cementing the mythology of the mafia. Yet behind the legend was a man who understood the delicate interplay of fear, respect, and opportunity, applying his insights to influence behavior, protect allies, and expand his empire. His legacy is also a cautionary tale. Ambition and brilliance coexisted with exposure to betrayal, legal pressure, and human unpredictability. The systems that enabled his rise also contained the seeds of his vulnerability. Luciano's life illustrates that power, no matter how strategically constructed, is contingent upon perception, loyalty, and circumstance. He left behind a model of influence and leadership that reshaped organized crime, demonstrating that true power is as much psychological as it is structural, and that intellect and foresight can extend dominance far beyond physical reach. The story of Lucky Luciano is a study in ambition, brilliance, and human complexity. Rising from the crowded streets of New York to command a criminal empire, he mastered not only operations but human psychology, orchestrating loyalty, fear, and perception with unparalleled skill. Yet his life also demonstrates the fragility of power. Legal pressure, betrayal, and shifting alliances ultimately exposed the limits of even the most calculated dominance. Luciano's myth is as compelling as the man himself. To the public, he became the archetype of the modern mobster, a figure of intelligence, ruthlessness, and audacity. Behind the legend, however, lay a strategist whose influence extended far beyond immediate control, showing that true power relies on perception, networks, and psychological insight as much as wealth or territory. His life offers lessons that transcend organized crime. Power is never absolute. It is contingent on human behavior, loyalty, and circumstance. Leadership requires foresight, manipulation of perception, and the capacity to anticipate both ambition and betrayal. Luciano's rise and fall illustrate that success and vulnerability are inseparable, and that even the most brilliant systems are subject to the unpredictable forces of human nature. In the end, Luciano remains both myth and man, a visionary, a strategist, and a psychologist of power. His legacy, the empire he built, the systems he designed, and the cultural archetype he embodied, continues to shape organized crime, leadership studies, and the imagination. His life is a mirror of ambition, consequence, and the intricate dance between intellect and morality, reminding us that power, like the human mind, is both limitless and precarious.